So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Giulia Mori, and I am coordinating this seminar series on behalf of unu-merit and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The Migration Seminar Series brings together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and others to discuss their work on migration-related topics. And before introducing today's speaker, I would like to go through a few brief housekeeping points. So today's talk will last approximately 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes for discussion and questions from the audience. So I kindly ask you to keep your questions for until after the presentation. You can either write them in the chat here, or you can use the raise hand function, and I will then give you the floor. In the meantime, please keep your microphones muted. You are also welcome to turn your camera on if you wish, but please note that this session is being recorded for dissemination via our YouTube channel. And also on our YouTube channel, you can also find recordings from previous migration seminars from the past years. So let me introduce now today's speaker. We are really pleased to welcome Nicolás Caso. He's a PhD fellow in economics and health sciences at Ghent University and the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies, or UNU-CRIS. His work focuses on migration and its drivers, with particular attention to the development implications of disasters, conflict, and unfulfilled migration aspirations. Before joining Ghent University, Nicolás worked as a research assistant at Prio Migration Center, where he conducted quantitative analysis for two major migration-related projects, the MIGNEX project and the FUMI project. During this seminar, Nicolás will present results from published work on the reach and impact of migration information campaigns based on the MIGNEX survey data. So really nice and warm welcome to Nicolás, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. It is indeed a great pleasure to join today's seminar. So thank you for the invitation and for making it happen. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about the reach and impact of migration information campaigns based on the MIGNEX survey data. But as I did not know who was going to be joining today's seminar, I did prepare some context slides to provide some background on what migration information campaigns are and how we should think about them. And I'm going to be presenting results of already published work, as Julia correctly said, and this work is co-authored with Jürgen Carling, who was the project lead of the MIGNEX research project. Let's see if this works now. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to start with some context. I'm going to talk about EU migration policy and the role that migration information campaigns has on that. And then I'm going to proceed to tell you a little bit about my research, which was the main research question that we were aiming to answer, the data we use, which methods we relied on in terms of being able to build an association between these campaigns and migration aspirations, the results, and then some conclusions that we draw based on our results. Then we will have around 20 minutes as well for a Q&A session. I think I will take a bit less than 40 minutes, so we might finish a little bit before 3. Yeah, so about the context. Before the famous EU Migration and Asylum Pact, we used to have something called AMIF, right? The Asylum Migration and Integration Fund. In 2019, the AMIF published a call for proposals for different topics that were different policy tools that they were aiming to implement to tackle different aspects of migration management. And under topic 4, they were calling for proposals with respect to awareness raising and information campaigns on the risks of irregular migration in selected third countries and within Europe. So basically what they wanted to do was to based on a list of selected third countries, create different types of messages through different kinds of channels to let people know about the different risks of following irregular pathways to reach Europe, mostly. At that moment in time, in 2019, this call for proposals reached a total lump sum of around 5 million euros. So this was the amount that was allocated for different companies and consultancy companies to fund and to design and implement these campaigns in different places. Yet, when it came to understanding whether they had the expected impact they wanted them to have, which is to prevent people from following irregular pathways, we kind of didn't know right after the implementation of these campaigns. So what the EU Commission did was to hire two consultancy companies, one called Ecoris and the other one called CFAR, to produce this final report on the best practices in irregular migration awareness raising campaigns and assess to which extent these 5 million euros that were invested in these campaigns did produce changes in people's intentions and behavior of migrating irregularly. Unfortunately for them and for the EU Commission, according to this report, we saw that half of the campaigns did not set effective objectives from the onset. So many of these funds that were allocated were used to implement these kind of campaigns, but they did not have a clear theory of change, and objectives were not clearly defined. In turn, this contributed to the success of them being very elusive and or unverifiable, right? So just to put things in a timeline again, we have in 2019 the EU Commission with very good intentions funding 5 million euros of campaigns to teach or to let potential migrants know about the risks of migrating irregularly. These funds are then allocated throughout 2020, 2021, and then we have these consultancy companies that produce this report and highlight that basically most of these campaigns did not actually achieve their desired outcomes. Then, a few years later, I'm going to skip this, we have something that we know now, of course, is the new EU Migration and Asylum Pact. I have a little video for it. Let's see if it plays. And can you let me know, Julia, if you can listen to the sound? Like, do you hear that?
No, we don't.
No, we don't. Usually when
Okay,
you share your screen, you have
that's all
to
right.
immediately. Oh,
But
maybe
that's
do we hear?
okay.
No.
I mean, it was only for the sake of the content.
Something to be done.
And basically, what I wanted to share with you is that in the context of the new EU Migration and Asylum Pact, the European Commission decided to invest once again in this policy tool, which are the migration information campaigns, but this time decided to double down their bet. So instead of investing 4.8 million euros in migration information campaigns, they now allocated in April last year 10 million euros. So in this context, one has to ask oneself whether these migration information campaigns are really contributing to their desired objective, which is to reduce people aspirations to move at least irregularly. So the main objective of my research with Jorgen, and which is what I'm going to be presenting today, is to contribute to this little evidence on the effects of these campaigns on migration aspirations, okay? So we're going to be looking at the effects of these campaigns on people's intentions or desires to move rather on their actual behavior. So to put it again in very simple terms, the main research question of this research is, do migration information campaigns shape migration aspirations? And in order to answer this question, I'm going to be relying on the Mignex survey data. And why the Mignex data? First and foremost, because I think it has great timing. If you remember from 3 minutes ago, I was letting you know that the timeline was that in 2019, the AMIF was funding 5 million euros in these campaigns, and the migrant survey data was collected between 2020 and 2022, which means that in the places where the survey data was collected, perhaps some of these campaigns might have reached some of the respondents. The Minix data is a survey that lasted these 2 years for its collection, that goes across 25 communities spread around 10 different countries, of which most of them are in Africa, East or West Africa, but also we have Turkey, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The Minix survey was a random sampling survey. It counted with 500 face-to-face interviews of around 45 minutes per household, which led to a sample of 500 respondents per community, which multiplied by the 25 communities that we have in the whole of the study. We are talking about a sample of around 12,000 people. It's a full random sampling sample of young adults, as I told you before. And the only selection criteria was that at the time that we knocked on each one of the households' doors, that we will find at least one adult over 18 years old to open us the door, and that we will be able to select someone that was aged between 18 and 39. Other than the age, there is no other selection criteria. So basically, we were asking the Minix survey questions to a very randomly selected group of people without any prior migration experience, without knowing whether they wanted to move to somewhere or not, and in very different realities. As you can see, these are very different countries, and the variation within each one of these countries is also quite high. I'm gonna show you a little bit about the selection criteria of these countries and communities. But when the Mingnex project was funded, the people that was in charge of the design, they had to come up with a list of communities where they will do the research and the survey, and they selected these places based on their prior research experience, but also with the intention of collecting very different realities to see how migration and development will interact in very different contexts. So as you can see, for example, on the right side of the slide, we have two pictures from the sky, one from Cabo Verde in São Nicolau and another one from Radeyef in Tunisia. And as you can see, they look very different, right? One is very small, more rural, whereas the other one is way more urban. And we can also see that there is a very big highway crossing right in the middle, right? So the idea, just to show you this, is that to point out that the Minix survey data is quite rich in its variability, and it's also quite rich in its content. So it really proposes a rich data set to study the potential exposure to these migration information campaigns and whether they triggered any change on migration aspirations, controlling for all sorts of development conditions. These 10 countries are top countries of origin of irregular arrivals to Europe. They are also transit countries immediately outside Europe's external borders, and they are also regional transit countries for migrants. With respect to these 25 communities, we selected at least 2 communities per country. That's how we came up with the 25 number. As I said before, they were theoretically relevant diversity of development experiences, which means that some of them were supposed to be thriving, some of them were supposed to be facing a quite strong economic hardship, for example. Some of them were relatively small, with not even 10,000 people, and some of them were relatively larger, with even 100,000 inhabitants. As I said, the idea was also that we will have a lot of complementarity within and between countries and communities to have a very diverse data set to allow for all sorts of statistical analysis. So based on this survey, we did have a few questions on migration information campaigns. So as I said, between 2020 and 2022, a group of interviewers, enumerators, started knocking randomly on people's households in each one of these communities, and they held a 45-minute interview. And within this 45-minute interview, they could ask the question that I'm going to read out loud now. Sometimes there are TV shows, events, or other information about migration, about people moving from one country to another. Over the last year, have you seen or heard of any of the following in your community? A TV advert or program about migration, a workshop or event about migration, a radio program or advert about migration, social media or a website about migration, and a poster or newspaper advert about migration. Right? So we ask people broadly whether they have seen or heard about migration in any of these channels. And then we ask them spontaneously to say what they remember these campaigns were about. So they could basically set whatever they would remember about these campaigns about migration. Then we analyze all these 12,000 answers, and we coded them and ranked them based on different labels. And we came up with four main different categories. One of them was whether the message was warning against migrating. Another one was whether the campaigns were telling them to migrate. Another one was whether the campaigns were telling them not to migrate. Another one was whether the campaigns were telling them about the risks about migration or migrating irregularly. And one of them was about how they could migrate. So those were basically like the different categories that we ended up coming up with based on the 12,000 responses. For those that are not familiar with these migration information campaigns, I also decided to show you some examples. Some of these campaigns are actually migration information campaigns, like the two square samples that you can see on the left side of these four images. These are a campaign that were implemented in Senegal, that were showing how the life in Europe could look alike if people migrate, or also preventing them about the risk about migrating. So this is a campaign that is being implemented by the local government and is as such a truly migration information campaign, if you want to call it that way. But then on the upper right side, you can also see a migration information campaign, if you want to call it too, about a company that facilitates scholarship assistance for people that want to go and migrate to the United States, Canada, the UK, or any other English speaking country in Ghana. Which can be perceived to the eyes of people as also a migration information campaign. And then below on the right side, we have a video as well implemented by a local NGO about the risk of migrating irregularly. So why am I showing you this landscape? Just to show you that migration information campaigns are not only something that has been promoted and implemented by the EU Commission, it's also something that happens and is being implemented by other entities too. So people might remember different messages around migration and from different sources. It's a very diverse and wide information landscape. So going back to the data, as I told you before, one of the key categories that people declare having remembered was these campaigns telling them not to migrate. So not about the risks, not about how to migrate, not about legal pathways, but actually telling them not to go. And surprisingly, if you want to call it that way, most of the people that did remember a migration campaign remember this campaign as telling them to actually not go. So if we start from the first slide, right, from the AMIF funding 5 million euros on campaigns to prevent people about the risks of irregular migration and providing reliable information of legal pathways, what people actually get in practice, when you ask them, what do you remember from these campaigns, is actually these campaigns telling them not to go. As a matter of fact, for half of the people that did remember the message, the main message they remember was this campaign not to go. And when you dig a little bit deeper in each one of the migrant communities, it's shockingly to see that in places like Moyale in Ethiopia, Bofa in Guinea, or in Besud in Afghanistan, 6 out of the 10 people that did hear or see one of these migration information campaigns only reckon that these campaigns were telling them not to go to their destination, basically. When it comes to the different channels, the channel composition is quite varied depending on the different places. But the most common channel so far is still television, is the most common channel in half or a little bit more than half of the sample. Then social media and online websites and landing page, which is something that I expect will have changed dramatically over the last 5 years. And I think that this one will probably be on the first place if we will redo this study now. Then radio are still relevant in at least 3 places. And even though some of these channels are more salient or prevalent in one of the communities, the composition is quite homogeneous across all the different communities. So that's what we will call in economics, right, our main independent variable. We're going to be looking at the exposure to these warnings against migrating, regardless the channel, and we're going to see how that is associated with people wanting or not wanting to move, which is what we call as well our dependent variable in an economics framework, right? So in terms of the data on migration aspirations, we're going to be looking at 2 main indicators. One is what we call the preference to leave, and the other one, which is the readiness to leave. The preference to leave is basically a yes or no question, which is, would you like to go and live in another country sometime during the next 5 years, or would you prefer to stay in that country? So if you were in Afghanistan and you were approached by the migrants team, they will ask you of whether you would like to leave Afghanistan or whether you would prefer to stay in Afghanistan. So it's a dummy or binary variable. And we also consider as a migration aspiration the readiness to leave, which reads as follows. If someone were to give you the necessary papers to live and work in a richer country, will you go or will you stay in the country of residence of the respondent and at that moment in time? So 2 possible migration aspirations variables. In terms of their distributions, we can see that there is a lot of variability in terms of the preference to live and the readiness to live, depending on each community of the migrant survey, with very dramatic high levels in places like in Nigeria, like in Ekpoma and in down quarters, right, where we see that most of the people, the vast majority of the people, will prefer to go and live in another country, and if they were provided with the means to do so, they will certainly seize the opportunity. Though, while this is the preference for the vast majority of the people in these places, we also see that in places like, especially in Pakistan, migration preferences, aspirations, and the readiness to seize an opportunity to migrate are not as widespread as in Nigeria, for example. So there is a lot of variability. Then, as I said, we have a lot of variability on the migration information campaign side, and we have a lot of variability on the migration aspirations side too, which provides a very rich data set to assess whether there is an association between these two things. So in terms of like the analytical framework, what we want to do is to see whether the exposure to these campaigns is associated with higher or lower desires to leave the country, but we cannot do this only for these two variables. We need to control, obviously, for other sources of information about migration. So in our regressions, in our logistic regressions, we also include whether the respondents knew of failed migration attempts from someone else, to get a sense on whether these people were exposed to other sorts of like migration experiences. And we also include as a control whether the respondent, the person about we're going to be asking the information campaign and the migration aspiration information, had relatives or friends living in other high-income countries, to see whether these transnational ties, whether these connections with people abroad will mediate or spur, this association between the migration information campaign and the migration aspiration. We also control for other known determinants of migration aspirations: gender, age, whether the respondents were parents, their level of education, whether they were working or not, looking for a job or not, whether they were living with their partners or not, their level of wealth, and even whether they were affected by the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment we did the survey. So basically, in our analysis, we're going to be looking at the effects or associations between the campaigns and aspirations, controlling for all the variability of these different components that I just told you. So we're going to go to the results. I'm going to be presenting you the aggregated results in the form of a regression table. This is more or less how it looks like in practice. So basically, we're going to see on the orange side, in the upper part, we're going to be looking at three variations in terms of campaigns. So first of all, whether the person has been exposed to warnings against migrating. Then we're going to see the number of channels by which this person has been exposed to these messages, just to see whether people, if they see it on the TV, on the newspaper, and listen to it on the radio, whether that effect or association will be stronger. And then we're going to look at the strongest possible source, which is whether the person has been exposed to these warnings against migrating via these 5 channels. And we're going to see whether these 3 variants have a different or stronger effect on migration aspirations. And we're also going to be looking at the effects that knowing migrants from the community, knowing of failed migration experiences, and having transnational ties have an association that is stronger or weaker with migration aspirations. So that's how the table is going to look like in practice. And these are the results. So we have 3 main columns of results. Column A are the associations between the campaigns and the preference to leave the country. Column B are the associations between the campaigns and whether the people will be ready to seize the opportunity so that they will leave if they were giving the papers. And column C is the effect of campaigns on a combination of the preference and being ready to leave if they were giving the opportunity. And this table is actually relatively easy to read, in my opinion. So when you see an asterisk accompanying one of the numbers, it means that we find a statistically significant association. So for example, the first number that we can see on the upper left side of the table is a 0.01, and we don't see an asterisk, which means that there is no association between being exposed to one of these campaigns and preferring to leave the country. Whereas when we see the next effect that comes below in the column, which is a 0.06 with 3 asterisks, we can see that knowing a migrant from the community is statistically significantly associated with the preference to leave the country. And this 6 means that people that knows migrants from this community are 6 percentage points more likely to prefer to leave that country. Okay, so that's basically how you can read this table of results. Finally, what you can see in the last row is the number of observations, which is the number of respondents that we use for our analysis. So as I said, when you see an asterisk, you have a statistically significant effect. And when you don't, it means that you don't. And what this table is basically showing us is that there is no association between being exposed to one of these campaigns. There is no increasing association depending on the number of channels that you have been exposed to these campaigns. And there is no association even when you have been exposed through the 5 different channels. This when controlling for other sources of information and the demographics of the respondents too. And it's not that nothing matters, right? So we only see that our migration information campaigns variables do not matter. But when we look at other things that we knew matter from the onset, like knowing other migrants or knowing people abroad, we can see that we get highly consistent estimates across the different models. So knowing migrants from the community can or is associated between 6 and 8 percentage points with wanting to leave and being ready to do so. Knowing of other people's failed migration experiences is also associated with 9 to 13 percentage points higher likelihood of wanting to move and being able to do it. And having people living abroad is also associated with 5 to 6 percentage points higher likelihood of wanting to move and being ready to do it if given the opportunity. That's it. Those are the results. Rather simple if you ask me. So one can obviously ask himself if migration information campaigns do not shape aspiration, what does? Well, we knew from the previous table that other sources of information about migration, like the people you know abroad, people that have migrated, that live in your community, and people that have failed, have a strong statistical association. But we also know that there are certain things that are associated with lower migration aspirations. And here you can see some examples based on our same data. So respondents that were female, respondents that were married or cohabiting, or respondents that were parents, those were less likely to want to move and being ready to do it. Those that have people abroad, that know of other people's attempts, and that know about migrants in their community are more likely to want to follow their example. And also those that receive money from abroad, those that are unemployed, those that have higher education, and those that have lived abroad would like to repeat that experience. Those were the results. If we will take all the people and put them in a bag, all of them together, and come up with one association for the whole of the migrant survey. Yet, I also wanted to take a look at the different effects per community, and what we see is quite similar in the sense that for most of the communities, we do not find a statistically significant association. Here in this table, what you're looking at are the effects of the campaigns on the preference to leave and the readiness to do it. And when you don't see a color, like a colored box, it means that there are no associations. So as you can see, there are very few colored boxes. When you see a dot, it means that the sample was not big enough for us to detect a statistically significant effect. which happens in a few of the cases. And then we have red and blue boxes. We have 4 blue boxes, which means that those that have been exposed to the campaigns will be actually more likely to want to move. And we do find only statistically significant, let's say, evidence for a negative effect of these campaigns on the desires to move in Baidoa in Somalia. It's just one specific case for which the results are rather robust. So to some extent, the results at the community level for each one of the communities are quite consistent with the overall picture for the whole of the sample, but we do find this very strange positive effect in which in some places people that have been exposed to these campaigns will be actually more likely to want to move. Something that we can relate to confirmation bias, right? So people that have already their mind set on leaving is also people that is more likely to be attentive to migration about information about migration, sorry. So that's probably an hypothesis to explain that. And we saw that solely in Baidoa in Somalia, we do find a negative association for these campaigns, which means that they could be working there. So just to wrap it up, warnings against migration are widespread, as we saw in many of the places is the main message that people recall. We don't see a clear effect of migration information campaigns on aspirations. We observe that where the preference to leave is frequent, it remains high regardless of exposure to warnings against migration, right? So we saw that a lot of people has seen or heard these campaigns. We saw that most of them remember the message telling them not to go, but we also saw that the frequencies of people still wanting to move and being ready to do it are quite high. So this might be pointing to an attention confirmation bias. Knowing of failed migration attempts tends to have a positive effect on the preference to leave. As I said, we might think that people are already set in leaving. Just hearing or seeing other people fail might just be a confirmation that they are special and that won't happen to them. So they will just pursue their intention nonetheless. And having family or friends in a high-income country has a very strong and consistent positive effect on the preference to live. As I said, this is already published work in an outlet called Migration Policy Practice. It's a very accessible journal, it's open access, it's from IOM UN Migration, right? And you can just read this paper if you wish there. If you look for me on LinkedIn, I have posted about it extensively. And you can find some videos and other resources around it. Melissa Siegel, who is joining us today, also did a mini video about this research that you can consult on YouTube. And if you go to the Migration Policy Center, Migration Policy Collab, I think it's called, they also have a blog where they share research briefs in which there is also a note about this research. Yes, that's all. I think it took me a little bit less than 40 minutes, which is great. And I'm happy to answer any questions and receive any feedback about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicolás. And yes, thank you for being perfectly on time. So now, as I mentioned, you have the opportunity to ask questions on the presentation. You can either do that by writing your question in the chat and I can read the question out loud, or you can also raise your hand and ask the question directly. Yes, Parker?
Yeah, it didn't seem to be something that you were investigating in the migrant study, but I'm curious, between the advertisements that are pushing people towards migrating versus wanting people not to migrate, which sort of actors are doing each? Is there specific agencies, maybe local actors are more likely to do pro-migration messaging?
Yeah. So when I looked at the distributions of the different campaigns per message institution, let's say, they actually don't vary much. You can find people. These are what people remember. Remember that people think that is either the EU Commission or NGOs or even the local governments telling them not to migrate or to follow regular pathways. So there is no actual difference there. And as I said at the beginning, most of them actually just remember that the message was not go. So it's very hard to see whether other messages will be remembered by any other donors, for example, because people actually just don't remember people telling them legal pathways. Sorry.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question?
Well, I actually had a follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Which is it more common, I suppose, if it happens at all, for the messaging to be don't come irregularly, or was there messaging that's just like don't migrate at all as well, even legally?
Could you please repeat because I struggle to.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Was it only messaging that said don't migrate irregularly, or was there also some messaging? Well, of course, you didn't ask this in the study, but I'm curious whether it might be a thing. Whether there's also some messaging that's don't migrate at all, so don't follow legal pathways either.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. So basically, what we saw today are the associations with the message don't go. So warning against migrating for us means that the person remembered the message being telling them just not to go. That's regardless of the means. Another category was warning about the risks of migrating irregularly, but that one was actually small in frequency. So for a very small sample of the people, this was the main message they reckon. So that unfortunately did not allow to do more analysis because there was so little people that actually remember that message that we could not do this analysis for them. But you're right, this message also exists and some people do remember it. But in theory, if we follow what the funders are funding, this should be a very salient category. I mean, when you think about it, 10 million euros in advertisement in social media, for example, can take you very far. So it's rather surprising that people actually just remember the message telling them just don't come to Europe, basically, instead of like saying, yeah, they were telling me that the journey by boat is actually risky and there are other options. So that's something like a key takeaway, I think, for the policy implementation, right? There is a big gap between what's on paper and what ends up happening and what people ends up reminding.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think Toby has a question.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. And apologies, I arrived a bit late, so I hope the question makes sense and that you didn't cover it before I was joining. I was wondering, so the message is one thing, I believe the sender is yet another thing. And I was just wondering to what degree, maybe you're not investigating that specifically, but so what are your thoughts on the role that maybe the sender could play here, and like trust in the sender? To what degree is the sender usually visible, and do you think it would make a difference if, for example, like the government was warning against like risks on the migration route, etc.? So maybe any thoughts on along those lines? Thanks.
Yeah, senders matter. Sender credibility matters too. I did not cover that as part of this presentation, neither about the paper we published in MPP, but I think there is a paper by Sandra Morgenstein, I think is her last name, that goes about that specifically. She really focuses on sender types and sender credibility and tries to assess whether how much you trust the institution that is providing you the message actually plays a different role or not. So yeah, unfortunately not part of what I did, but there is some upcoming research about it.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. So Chen has a question.
Me.
We can't hear you really well. Maybe try again. Or otherwise, you can also write your question in the chat.
Yeah, in the meantime, I'm sharing in the chat box the paper by Sandra that I was referring to. I think we could almost hear you.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
Now, yes,
Now
we
we can hear you. Yeah.
okay. Sorry. My thesis is just about the migration information campaign, and I just find a trend that I think the narrative is from the deterrence narrative that lies people not warning people not to leave through tell them the risk to a trend that encourage people to return or reintegration. Just tell them through the aspiration narrative, tell them the successful choice that they can return to their home. I don't know, it's just a value direction to research or it really have this trend.
Oof, I'm not sure whether I understood the question, but I did agree with the first preamble about these campaigns being mainly about deterrence. To that, I certainly agree. Can you repeat the question though?
Yes, I just find some literature that is focused on the deterrence narrative, but I just find a trend that some information campaigns like to encourage people to return or reintegration, then tell them they stay and their home also have a good future. Just like this aspiration narrative. So I just don't know it's really have this trend or is a value direction to research.
I mean, yes, I think so. So, based on the same call that I was sharing at the beginning, those campaigns were not only funding information in third origin countries, let's say, but also within Europe, and they were also targeting people that were in transit and encouraging return migration. So, I think, as with Tobias' comment, this research agenda can be expanded in many directions. What I did with Jürgen, I think, is quite wide, and it was just with the objective to see, okay, do people actually remember these campaigns? What do they remember they are about? And does that correlate with aspirations at all or not? But indeed, different senders, the credibility of the senders, the type of messaging, whether there is a difference on the effects on aspirations of deterrence, and whether there is a difference on the effect of return promotion on that behavior, I think are all needed and policy relevant questions at this stage.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Noor?
Yes, thank you. My question is maybe more about the approach. Do you think there may have been maybe power dynamics influencing the responses of participants? For example, that some participants would say that they're unwilling to migrate due to maybe mistrust of the researcher or maybe even the state.
Yeah, so when you do survey research, you are of course confronted with all these sources of biases and errors in collecting the data. But I would say, based on the way the survey the Mignex survey was implemented, sorry, that I'm not very worried about it. While the Mignex project was funded by EU Horizon, the people that actually did the survey were locals, let's say within brackets. So basically, the Mignex consortium went and hired local contractors that would find people residing in these places usually to conduct the different interviews. And there was not too much mention on the institutions, neither the ambitions of the study when introducing it. So yeah, I don't think it's very big concern or too much of a concern. Also, because when you look at the summary statistics at the beginning, actually a lot of people declares wanting to move and being willing to do it. So people willingness to declare these aspirations and preferences do not seem to be an issue to me, at least. So it's a great question, but I think that in this case doesn't really play a decisive role.
Thank you.
It's very different in contexts where I go and I do in-depth interviews. As I'm an international student, as I look in a particular way, I come with a bag of stereotypes that might bias the responses of someone that I interview, for example, in South Senegal. But when local contractors are contracted to execute the interviews, and those are being done by young people from the village or the city that is closest by, I don't think that that's too much of a concern, to be honest.
Thank you, Nico. I think we have time for another question at least, if someone has something to ask.
Yeah, maybe I can close with a closing remark.
Sure.
The objective of this research was to mainly see whether this policy tool did work or not. And even so, when we might find that they work or not, I think that migration information campaigns should always be questioned because of their ethical concerns. Regardless their effectiveness, I think that migration information campaigns are highly problematic. They intend to change behavior. They are poorly targeted, and we might find ourselves funding and publishing adverts that prevent people from migrate, that tell people not to move, when their actual conditions will actually allow them and will be the best option for them. So targeting people that will be able to seek asylum, for example, and tell them not to go, I think is highly problematic. So I think these campaigns can be questioned not only by their effectiveness, but also by their ethical design.
Thank you, Nicolás. Okay, if nobody has other questions, so this is your last chance to ask a question.
I mean, you can always send me an email if you want.
Yeah.
I'm not dying right after the
Yeah. So, well, again, I think we can then wrap it up here. Again, thank you very much, Nicolás, for this really interesting presentation of your work. And also, yes, please check out the Mignex website. You can find a lot of different interesting publications that use this data. And then I also would like you to remember that we're going to publish today's seminar on the YouTube channel. So if you want to have a look at the slides again, you can do so. And then we will have our next migration seminar on May 7th at 4 p.m. Central European Time. So thank you to everyone who attended, and see you at the next seminar. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.